Good,
Yes.
we can.
Okay. So my presentation today is about an overview of privacy risks in 5G networks. Obviously, this is a quite new, relatively new topic, especially from the legal point of view. Since we have quite a lot of materials and articles and different research going on about privacy risks, security risks, even data protection risks in 5G networks from computer science point of view, from networking point of view. But when it comes to law, and especially implementation of law, we are still at the very, very starting point, at the very beginning. And there is little coherency in our legislation. And I'm writing a PhD on this topic. And I hope to share some of my initial findings with you today. We're going to concentrate on the European Union today. So I won't be able to comment on China or the United States, possibly later. So the agenda is talking a little bit about main innovations in 5G, mainly what happened in 5G networks compared with 4G or 1G or whatever, that we have to talk about privacy again, although many people consider that 5G is just a new generation of good old mobile network we are all familiar with. Then briefly about applicable EU law, so we understand how the system functions, which law affects the implementation of 5G networks in the European Union. Then we're going to talk about data protection and privacy challenges themselves in 5G in general, and then focus a bit on consent rules in virtualized environment and the challenge of new stakeholders in 5G networks. Then conclusion, and then I would be very happy to hear your questions. Briefly, who are we? I represent CITIC, the KU Leuven Centre for IT and IT Law in Belgium. We focus on different fields, primarily on IT and IT. And I'm working on 5G as a use case and exploring privacy, security, and data protection risks in 5G. So what are the main innovations in 5G? Obviously, they are technical, but also business-oriented, which makes implementation of privacy challenging. First of all is that specific hardware for telephony is no longer used or almost not used in 5G networks, as it was already standard, obviously, in 1G, 2G, 3G networks, and 4G networks. 5G is very, very different. We can even go as far as saying that 5G is not really the fifth generation of mobile networks, but a first generation of something very, very new. Why is that so? Large-scale use of virtualization techniques and containers and orchestrations. Specifically, 5G networks, they are going to move towards virtualization and cloud services much more than 4G and 3G networks. And they are going to take advantage of virtualization technology to make the transfer of data and processing of data faster and easier. That's what differs 5G from previous networks. Of course, there are also MIMO, massive input, massive output. There are also antennas. There are also updates in hardware. We're going to talk specifically about virtualization part, since that's where all the privacy risks, almost all the privacy risks are. Infrastructure, interoperative and accessible by internet equipment means that 5G will rely more on internet, obviously, since it's going to take advantage of edge computing and cloud services. And as a rule, we know that if you can access the internet can access you, meaning if you have something connected to the internet, you have to presume that this piece of equipment which is connected is a possible target for a possible attacker. And obviously 5G transferring lots and lots of data, not just business data, but also sensitive data, which might be useful not only for hackers, but also foreign governments, is of course at risk. And finally, software-defined networking, network function virtualization, and network slicing technologies. That might sound a bit hard to understand, but those are three primary technologies, or SDN and FDNS, which are parts of virtualization techniques used by 5G, which allow us to create dynamic networks and process data at a very, very fast speed. And that is one of the main challenges I'm going to talk. Applicable EU law, very briefly, we have European Convention on Human Rights, then we have Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. They define the right to privacy and the right to private communication specifically, which is more interesting for us in this case, on a very, very general level. And then we have some sector-oriented laws, European Electronic Communications Code, which directly mentions 5G and explains us and tells us that the 5G is going to provide services specifically for transport sector, energy sector, e-health, public protection, Internet of Things. Why is this important? Because it shows us how much sensitive data is going to run through 5G networks and the need to regulate this. Then we have NIS directive, which EU directive, which is aimed at protection of critical infrastructure in the European Union, and Cybersecurity Act. Both these laws, two of them, are regulating the security part, the security element, also applicable to 5G, but obviously security and privacy are connected. And then we have a privacy directive, and possibly we will have e-privacy regulation. Recently, there has been some progress on e-privacy regulation, which is going to be a sector-specific, communication-specific regulation aimed at tackling issues like privacy and data protection, also in 5G networks. And then obviously we have technology neutral and quite general law, General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which is the last one in the list, but definitely not the least. And it influences the implementation of 5G in the European Union greatly. So what are the main challenges we can mention? So 5G is a major enabler for the Internet of Things. And it includes, as I mentioned some of them before, remote surgery, telemedicine, autonomous cars, smart homes, smart highways, etc. So in the future, our smart cities and our autonomous cars, autonomous trucks, delivery of goods, logistics, medical services, all of them are going to rely on 5G. Perhaps not entirely, but 5G provides speed, low latency, and that's what makes these technologies possible. That's why 5G is major enabler. And obviously, you can imagine how much of that data, medical data, logistics data, can be accessed by possible attackers, stolen, and that's why privacy is important. Also, 5G, since it's enabler for the IoT, allows us to connect everything to the internet that can be connected. And that causes that we will have massive amounts of IoT sensors and devices for the process of so-called omnipresence, where everything, unless you live in a really, really remote area, everything around you will be surrounded by IoT sensors. You are going to be surrounded by IoT sensors, and that causes huge risks to privacy, such as gathering large amounts of data and precise geolocation. And these internet-based cloud storages, which are going to be used for 5G, because they enable fast speed and fast processing of data, they are vulnerable to a wide range of possible attackers, again, because they're internet-based, and we don't have any separate network for 5G in Europe or elsewhere in the world. That's what can make it so fast, and that's why we are so interested in this technology. And all of this requires stricter standards for handling and processing this data. Since it's going to be transferred from perhaps a 5G antenna in Germany, this gathered data in Germany will be then transferred to some edge computing or data processing storage, perhaps in the Netherlands, because it might be easier for the purposes of providing speed and reliability. But then again, we have an issue of transferring this data being in transit, and then obviously risks related to actors and businesses, cloud service providers located outside the European Union. Most importantly and primarily in the United States, China, and maybe other territories with strong data processing facilities. The identification of individuals will be much, much easier in 5G networks, specifically geolocation, the use case I already mentioned. Obviously, surveillance will be more extensive and easier to be implemented, again with fast speeds. And we will have the issue of facial recognition. Now, facial recognition is a bit different part of the story, the different technology. 5G will enable it on a very large scale. All of this, geolocation, medical data, recognition of our faces will contribute to profiling, more extensive profiling, both by public and private entities, and also automated decisions on the basis of that. Another problem is that 5G, despite the fact that I mentioned that it might be the first generation of something very, very new, it inherits privacy problems from 4G and 3G, since a lot of solutions used in 4G and 3G are used in 5G. This is not a brand new technology. We're still using some of the old equipment from the previous generations. And as well, we're using those loopholes and problems from those networks or older generations. We already talked about virtualization technology, since it provides dynamism and fast speeds and massive amount allows us to get massive amounts of data. And that's where we might encounter a problem of loss of control. The EU law, GDPR specifically, guarantees that users are able to exercise their rights related to their personal data gathered by public or private bodies. However, in this case, if your data is gathered, in theory, you have the right to erasure, the right to be forgotten, so-called, where you can apply, and if you have sufficient legal grounds, private body, usually it's related to private bodies, they must delete their data and their records about you. However, in this case, we might encounter the loss of control, since you don't know where your data is going to. We have so many providers, so many new actors in 5G networks, cloud service providers, equipment providers, mobile operators. Mobile operators are not going to be the most important players in 5G anymore. And we simply won't know where to apply to erase our data, whom to sue, where to bring this responsibility. And that's where the issue of privacy by design also comes in play. Privacy by design is a relatively short rule which requires all of the businesses, providers, most notably software developers, but it applies to also offline businesses, to think about privacy and consider privacy at the very beginning when they design their business processes or make their business possible. So you have to think about privacy when you start developing an application, and you have to think about privacy at the very beginning if you are running a hospital, for example, obviously with a lot of sensitive data. And jurisdiction and applicable law conflict. Once again, as with loss of control, we don't know where this data is going, and we have the issue of transferring this data between different EU countries, from Germany to the Netherlands, from Spain to Lithuania, and so on. We don't know yet from which country to which. Most likely it will be from all of the countries to all other countries. But the most important issue, what to do with new actors, cloud service providers based in the United States, more say in China, application developers for 5G virtualized parts. What law applies to them, what their governments want them to do, what their governments want them to do with the data they gather. And then again, jurisdiction, where are we going to apply, file a lawsuit, complain, etc. And SDN, software-defined networking, allows us to highly customize network services, and privacy requirements will vary. Privacy requirements will vary from a mobile operator to a mobile operator, from a country to country, from a region to region. And as of today, we have a problem with ensuring this homogeneity, some single standard for privacy and security in 5G networks, even at the level of the European Union, and even at the level of one single EU member state. Consent rules is a very specific challenge when it comes to privacy issues in 5G, simply because obtaining a valid consent, your consent for processing of your personal data, will be very hard or virtually impossible, or even just impossible, depending on the researcher you're consulting with. Why so? How so? 5G networks, as I already mentioned, they collect data very fast, they process it very fast, they transfer it very fast. And we are simply finding ourselves in a situation where we are unable to ask a user to provide an informed, valid consent before we actually process their data. Because the moment you're outside, or maybe you're staying at home, through the 5G antennas, mobile operators and cloud service providers, different actors involved in 5G, will be able to get your precise geolocation, will be able to get more information about you, apart from your location, also traffic, whether you're using a phone, what exactly are you doing with that phone, how many gigabytes of data are you spending, and then you can deduce whether you're watching a video or making a call. And all of this is a huge problem since, as many of you know, when you're trying to enter a new website, these websites are trying to ask you, please provide a consent to cookies, or please provide consent to us using your personal data when you're making an account on some website. Here it's the same rule. GDPR tells us that we have to obtain a valid informed consent through an affirmative action. So a person has to push a button or say, yes, I agree, or some other form of affirmative action that will allow a company or public body to gather their personal data. So far, it is clear with 5G networks. If a law is passed which says that mobile operators have legitimate interest, for example, to gather this data about you, to precisely geolocate you, well, this is a huge privacy problem. We find ourselves in a lot of trouble, since after that, virtually everything, all kinds of personal data can be gathered under legitimate interest clause. And then we have a problem from vendors for 5G networks from non-EU jurisdictions. I already mentioned cloud service providers from the United States, from China, but also application developers, third-party non-European application developers, edge computing facilities, data storages, data cables, software-defined networking or network function virtualization service providers, and on. And you can imagine that all of these software development companies, huge cloud service providers coming from non-EU jurisdictions, they abide by their own rules. Obviously, they are bound by EU rules while they're operating in the EU, and we have some extraterritoriality of GDPR outside of the European Union. However, we cannot possibly punish anyone if we don't know what they're doing. And cloud service provider, for example, in the US, they will guard their interests, of course, and they will apply their own policies and their own view on how to handle this data. All of this is a problem of EU stakeholders in 5G networks. So it's about coordination, competing interests, and different privacy goals of all of these stakeholders in 5G networks, both in the EU and outside the European Union. And because we have so many different actors, with mobile operators serving as a starting point, we hand our personal data to them, since they're like entry point for our data, but then they transfer this data further. Cloud service provider, SDN provider, and IP provider, and we have no coherent privacy or security architecture whatsoever. Mobile operator applies their own rules, cloud service providers applies their own rules. And then we don't even know whether they coordinate these privacy standards between them. And roles and responsibilities regarding privacy, data protection, and security must be defined. So far, it's hard to see whether there is a coherent legal response in the European Union to this. We will see possibly the e-privacy regulation and the implementation of it through the courts will give us some clarity, but this is a main challenge for now. Obviously, different rules in different jurisdictions. I already mentioned that other countries may require their companies possibly to keep this data they're gathering in the EU, handle it somehow differently. We don't know that, we cannot control that. And another issue is more legal one is stability, consistency, and clarity of law. This is a problem in the European Union as well, since we have quite a lot of laws, and we have quite a lot of different laws, local, national, EU-wide, international. So there is a need to bring all of them into some sort of coherency. There is some work being done now, and I hope to see in the future, in 3, 4, 5 years, of course, I'm being an idealist, that we will resolve at least some of the many major problems we're facing now from the point of view of law. And one of them is the status of controllers and processors in virtualized 5G networks. As I mentioned, we have multiple actors, and we don't know who's exactly a controller, who is exactly the processor, who controls the data, who just processes this data on behalf of the controller. Will we have some joint controllers which are going to face responsibility in case of data leak or some privacy violations? This is unclear at this point of time, and we might say that mobile operator might be the controller of data, and then a cloud service provider might be the processor. But cloud service provider will actually have more possibilities to send this data all over the world and process it as they think fits, as it fits their interests, than the mobile operator in the European Union. The conclusions are quite hard in this case. Obviously, we have so many problems from legal point of view, inconsistency of law, lack of stability of law. We have some issues with business practices and business structure of our cloud service providers and actors in 5G value chain, because we don't know how their architecture from the software point of view, from business point of view operates. Lack of transparency, most obviously, and also unclear situation with their role and responsibility, with their rights to our data, with their responsibility, whether they can be sued and held liable in case anything happens with personal data gathered through 5G networks. And obviously we have technical technical points, namely NFV SDN. They ensure that best amounts of data can be gathered, transferred, processed almost instantly, and brought back to the user without user ever noticing that, in less than a second possibly. But at the same time, it creates the greatest vulnerability, because these massive amounts of data are unprotected in the clouds. They can be attacked, they can be accessed from anywhere from the planet. And we have to ensure the security, but obviously now no system is 100% secure. And whether we want all of that personal data being somewhere out there in the cloud about all of us, and sensitive data like medical or military data, well, that's one of the points to debate about. Well, although we can benefit from the best speeds and other, say, good sides of 5G technology. Now I'm ready to hear your questions about any part I've mentioned, or possibly something that I did not manage to talk about during my presentation.